So if I'm being honest, I don't think there are many spaces where people get to talk until such time as they are possibly reaching a point of crisis, which I think is quite sad.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, a podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast.
So, as people have probably gathered, we're really interested in the idea of emotional literacy on Locked Up Living. And today we're really pleased to welcome along ex-police inspector Paul Bradford. Paul worked for Thames Valley Police for 30 years and in his latter years was one of the managers responsible for force incidences and managing call handling. And Paul also did some research looking at how call handling might be influenced by emotional literacy. So really pleased to welcome you on today, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I feel very honoured to be here.
Hello, Paul. It's really good to meet you. So I wonder if we could begin by you telling us something about your professional career and how you came to be interested in emotional literacy.
I joined the police in 1988, which was a very different era to where we are now. And as I worked through my life, I suppose one of the first major influences, I found myself as a single parent quite early on, and trying to work in that in the police environment, certainly in that late 80s, and look after that was a significant challenge in itself. But it did help me when I reflected on things a lot later. But because of that had a very strong influence on the way my career developed. And I spent the first bit looking for roles within the police service that allowed me that bit of flexibility to look after, to meet my domestic obligations as well. I spent a lot of time initially working in neighbourhood policing, as they call it now, community policing, more as it was at the time. Actually, I suppose my favourite place at the time was Chipping Norton, which sort of has a bit more notoriety about it now with its connections with the Chipping Norton set, I suppose, than it did at the time. But it gave me a great exposure working in that community policing, spending time with victims of crime, people who wanted to contact the police, who needed the services of the police. And I had the time to spend with people and deal with people. It was a different era. It was pre-performance management era, where it very much became later in my career about managing performance. If you couldn't measure it, should you be doing it? Attitude. So I was very fortunate, I believe, at that time that it gave me that level of access to victims of crime in particular, and people trying to access the services of the police, where I could give some serious time to them. As I developed as well, I took promotion, and I suppose my next step of great note for me, again, in terms of my development, in terms of this, was to become a custody sergeant. And again, at a time where it was the Crown Prosecution Service making charging decisions, and that was left with the responsibility of the custody sergeant, as I was at that time, and the same with making bail conditions. But again, as a custody sergeant, I wasn't part of the investigation. I was there to be objective and to look at, is there sufficient evidence there to make this charge? And so you, again, one step removed, and sometimes at odds with your colleagues when it came to making those decisions. But it gave me a lot of access then to offenders or people who had been arrested and detained, and actually get to understand and know many of those, and look at many of their vulnerabilities. And even as an example, when there were people I'd known who I'd looked after as they were detainees, and then I'd hear that they died of an overdose, and actually how much that had affected me, because for me that was somebody that I had known. It wasn't a statistic. It wasn't. This was somebody I had a personal relationship with. So again, I found that part of my work quite formative. I obtained promotion again beyond that, and I spent most of my time as an inspector, either within neighbourhood policing, again managing resources. By this time, sort of performance targets were very much the thing, and managing crime and managing police response with limited resources to meet those things within a neighbourhood environment. Again, was a very different way of looking at the victims. And then moving into control rooms, again, as a force incident manager, managing critical incidents that are spontaneously coming into there, but also overseeing the call handling side and looking at how that side of it was happening. I saw very much product of my upbringing. There was no tradition within my family to go into further education or higher education, very traditional working class background. So I came to academic study quite late in life, and I was 50 and working as an inspector within the control rooms. And by that point, I was as a deputy head of the department and looking at more the overall service delivery, quality of service, and started doing part-time study at the University of Northampton for an undergraduate degree. So it was at that point that I then started wanting to make sure that the degree I did was applied criminal justice studies. And for my dissertation, I very much wanted to write about and research something that I was familiar with and something that I knew and hopefully would better inform me on how I was doing and why things were happening within the organisation that I was working within. That work sort of really, certainly looking at the emotional literacy side, really informed a lot of my thinking towards my own work and to how I wanted to develop my work, my area of work at that time. And I got involved at that point with a chap I'd been a PC with many years before that, called Jim Davis, who was a founder member of the Gypsy, Traveller and Roma Police Association. And he had instigated, or he'd been part of a review into police attitudes towards that group, and certainly how relationships could be improved, or awareness and could be improved with that. And I helped him, and he was very keen on the work that I'd done, sort of look at how we could apply. And this was the first, I suppose, challenge for me about how I could try and influence things with some of the research that I'd done. And I'd still argue that the attitude of the police towards that community is still a major issue that to be addressed. It was described to us as being the last bastion of overt systematic discrimination, I think, and I think there were some really good challenges that we had to look at within that. Jim's no longer in the police, so I've sort of lost contact with where that's got to as well. So anyway, I left the police service in 2018. I initially looked for a role either back in contact management or actually within lecturing as well. So I applied for a couple of jobs within HE and FE environments, but I haven't really got the skill base or the experience that was able to carry me forward. I still need to pay the bills, so hence coming and working at a college.
Brilliant. Well, there's a lot in there, Paul, that you've told us already. I was really interested in your description of being when you were the custody sergeant, because in a way that's a bit similar to being a researcher, kind of one step away from things and having to reflect upon matters.
Yes, and it is about ensuring that people are dealt with fairly, dealt with responsibly, and a lot of that research that I later did, certainly around procedural justice, sort of resonated very much with my attitudes towards. I had to use a phrase quite regularly with some of my colleagues that I would rather spend 20 minutes talking somebody into the cell than 5 minutes fighting them into the cell and then 3 hours writing it up afterwards. And that's the that's the reality of the situation. It is understanding, showing some empathy with somebody who's been detained, looking for their frustrations and looking how you can use your skills to manage their frustrations and get them to see how things are going to be.
Thank you. So you kind of told us a bit about why you came to study call handling, and I think you were almost suggesting that it was by chance, although you had worked in the control room. And my recollection, Paul, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, is that originally the people who answered the phones and took calls were policemen or police women, and that it was only later on that they came to be civilians. Is that correct?
Initially, working with certainly in the organisation that I joined, there was a mixture of civilians, staff, and police officers working within the control room environment. But it was very much police officers being taken off shift, and it was your turn to go and do 6 months in the control room. As times progressed, it's been recognised that it should be a specialist role, and was one of the first roles really that was civilianized. Over time, we've had I think the 999 service has been around since about 1937, and the 101 service has been around for about 20 years, and the police service, certainly back in the 1990s, recognised that it wasn't handling calls particularly well. If you phoned your local police station, you were put through to the person who was on the desk. They were also dealing with people's on the front counter, and people were being put through to CID or other departments, and the call handling was just extremely poor. So I'm probably in the mid-90s, certainly before the turn of the century, we'd created, or were starting to create, these call handling hubs, where the principle was if you took an incoming call, you would retain that and you would deal with it, where there would be no just passing people round between, because that's incredibly poor service and incredibly frustrating for anybody, whether you're a victim or just trying to access service at any level, if all you're constantly doing is repeating the same plea for help to a group of different people who are all passing it on to one another, to somebody else. So that once you started bringing that together in call handling centres, and Thames Valley has got 2 call handling centres in effect, one in Milton Keynes and one in Abingdon, that cover the whole of the 3 counties, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire and Berkshire. And that has become, you get efficiencies of scale, you get concentrations of specialist skills in those areas. So yes, it is something that moved on over time, but probably longer than you realise.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some of the challenges of the call handling role?
The call handling role, I think, is it is such a vital part. The members of the public don't contact the police lightly. It's a conscious decision, and for many, it's quite a taboo thing to do to actually overcome that. So for many, that initial contact is a big step. There may be social pressures as to why you shouldn't, from the community that you're trying to do that. So you've got varying levels of expectation there already. I suppose certainly from the research that I did, and it came out mainly, I think, from America. Is this? I think there's the work by a chap called Scoggin, who identified that people have less confidence or trust in the police, or hold them in less esteem, the more contact they have with them. And there is a definite correlation between those people who've had recent contact with the police have less confidence in the police than those people who've had no contact or contact some time ago. So for me, I suppose the challenge in that call handling is that the call handlers are the gateway to the police service. That first encounter, there's no question about it. You never get a second chance to make a first impression, and a lot of damage can be caused in terms of that confidence in the police service through that initial contact. And I suppose whilst I was trying to prepare myself before we came here, I did have a look at some more recent data, because I'm very mindful that my research work was more than 5-6 years ago now. And there's a Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire Service did a report in 2019 about the control rooms. Now, the control room is one of the engine rooms of the police force. It doesn't have the right systems and process in place. The force won't have an accurate picture of demand. This will affect its ability to respond to calls and investigate crimes effectively. Answering the public's calls for help is hugely important work. The people who do it are amongst, almost without exception, dedicated and professional public servants, doing their best within the limits of technology and management structures in their forces. Yet they are often unsung and undervalued. Their career paths and opportunities for development are often limited, and they don't always receive the wellbeing support they need. Often staff take calls that aren't police emergencies or routine police work, and which other agencies would be better placed to deal with. This extra demand can result in calls from vulnerable people going unanswered and unassessed. Forces need to make sure this improves and vulnerable victims receive an appropriate service. The lack of agreed and consistent national standards for how long it should take to attend an emergency makes it difficult to draw meaningful comparisons between forces. The public have no way of understanding how the service they are receiving compares with other forces. It is a time for the police service to agree national sets of response standards for emergency calls. Over the last few years, the number of calls are growing exponentially. The pressures that are on call takers to take calls and more calls are constant and unremitting. The environment in which the call handlers work is very similar to commercial call centres as well. And part of the challenge within police call handling is that you're being benchmarked against commercial call handling skills for commercial centres as well, because there's no other real aspect of police work that can be so readily benchmarked against commercial activity. So public expectation is quite high, and it's very easy to feel let down by inadequate service. The two main quantitative targets that are set for police are answering 999 calls within 10 seconds and avoiding abandoned calls, which is quite right and proper. 999 calls are there for people who are in an emergency and they need assistance now. But answering those calls and the pressure to answer those calls means that more routine calls don't get answered. And there's a lot of evidence I can see over the last few years that confidence in the 101 service is eroding as people are waiting so long to be answered on the 101 service, and are then reverting to using the 999 service so that they can get through, which is compounding the problem. And the pressures that puts on individuals who are phoning the police, who, as you quite rightly picked up, we've moved away from having local police services answering their calls locally to centralised control centres, which can give a sense of the police are more remote from us, from my community, to the benchmarking against how your call would be handled by a commercial organisation. There is plenty of room for people who've got a high expectation of service delivery to feel somewhat let down by the answer or by the response that they're getting. And this translates, the ongoing danger for this is that it erodes legitimacy of the police. If people don't have trust and confidence in the police, then they lose. The whole British policing model is dependent on policing by consent. That if there is no trust, if there is no confidence in that policing service, if they feel alienated from that service, or that service is not interested in them or their community, then you won't have the legitimacy to deliver that service.
That's very interesting, because what you seem to be suggesting is that we tend to regard the police service as a kind of singular entity, and if we receive a bad impression at the beginning, then that kind of lasts. So it's different from, say, I've been into shops and been upset many times, but it doesn't stop me going back because I know I can deal with somebody else, or I don't have to meet the person I've been rude to or has been rude to me. But for the police force, this seems to have quite a kind of an effect of forming an impression which is then difficult to shift.
And that's very true. The research, certainly the American research that Tyler has done around procedural justice, and Scoggin has done around attitudes towards the police, has looked at as David Waddington, I think his name is, an academic who has tested those theories again as they apply within the UK. And and has found that it's very much it's obvious that if you treat people who are fair, and if the procedure that they deal with they perceive to be fair and transparent, and they're treated with respect, in many ways the outcome can be less important. It's that fact that somebody's been treated with respect, they've been listened to, they've been taken seriously in what it is that they want to, and they believe that they are being treated with fairness and transparency. That will go a long way. However, if your previous experience of the police has been poor, that's eroded any trust and confidence, or got you to the point where you're from a community that has no trust or confidence in the police, then even being treated with fairness and respect, and you're being listened to and you're being taken, can be taken as either, well, that's just a one-off fluke, that's not what they're all really like. It can be that actually you can't do anything just through those initial transactions other than amplify that they were right by giving a poor service again. And again, it's that whole thing, if the phone isn't answered, if the phone's answered by somebody who's been very hasty and wanting to get on to the next call, somebody who you believe is not listening to you because they're asking a series of questions that is trying to pigeonhole that particular thing, or indeed, again, you look at most of my motion, I think, came when I first started looking at that, was dealing with complaints that were being made against members of my staff, And I mean, part of the pressure that the call handlers work with is everything is monitored. So every single call that they receive, a supervisor can listen back to. And that, and so from actually investigating a complaints point of view as a manager, it's very straightforward from my point of view, because I can listen to exactly what was said. I can read exactly what was recorded, or could, sorry, at that particular time, as to how it was going. And almost without exception, what the staff were saying was in line with the guidance that they were being asked to deliver, the structures that were being put in place for them, and it was almost that thing that you say to children: it's not what you're saying, it's the way you're saying it, and it was a lack of emotional connection, I suppose, that was said. So going back, it was how if I was looking at quality service, how can I reduce complaints? How can I improve the skill levels for my staff? Because I don't believe very many people, if anybody at all, goes into work, especially in that environment, wanting to do a bad job. People want to do a good job, and in many cases it's about helping them develop those skills and to be able to do that. And that emotional connection is so vitally important to make people feel, or to help people feel valued, and that the police are genuinely taking what they're saying seriously, that they're on their side with regards to that, and they're going to be treated fairly in line with, as I say, the procedural justice principles. Very much of that was how, developing my thinking, was how I could sort of overcome that. It's not so much what people were saying, what people were doing, it's how they were saying it.
It's a very pressurised environment that you're describing, working, and very pressurised conditions, that sense of being under surveillance in some degree, but also obviously the content of what people might be hearing could also be really distressing. So, I used to man a phone line for Rape Crisis Centre, and I remember people occasionally phoning up when they were in the midst of a crisis and having to kind of like gauge from the limited information that I was getting about whether I actually needed to phone for emergency services for them myself. So I can only imagine what it must be like to be listening to some of the distressed people that must phone up in the midst of a serious incident.
And it's true, and we've got limited resources. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the data I was looking at prior we was coming, is how different. There is a lack of consistency across the country about how calls are resolved, but the demand is far outstripping the resources available for most forces. But there are some forces that have a policy that they will attend all incidents that require attendance. And then at the other extreme, there was one force recording that they dealt with 53% of their incidents without any police attendance. The emotions that are involved in trying to explain to somebody that you're not, a police officer isn't going to attend, and to be able to do that with the social skills so that people feel valued, that we're not. I take the example of a burglary from a shed in your garden was always categorised as being a non-dwelling burglary, but a dwelling burglary would obviously be given a lot more priority. But if it were your parents' gardening tools that have got tremendous sentimental value to you and to them that had been taken, you would want or feel that you were entitled to a police response, and then to come out and at least look at where they've broken into and the damage that's been caused. But call handlers, regardless of how much they sympathise with the position of the call handler, they know that even if they take that, and there's a danger that they overpromise and say, yes, we'll get somebody out to see you, knowing that actually, probably it won't happen, because that job would never reach, when you're under pressure, at the top of their list of priorities, where you're having to base your response on risk and harm, and it has to go to the highest threat, the highest risk, and somebody can wait in all day and still not reach the top of the list, unfortunately.
So, as you know, we recently interviewed Charlotte Knight, who discussed the traditional aspiration for the criminal justice system to be objective and emotionally neutral. And yet there is this pressure in society, and especially in the media, isn't there, for more emotionality. So I suppose use of very emotive words like monstrous and evil when describing people who commit crimes. But you also refer to this kind of pressure on policing, the idea that you're expected to be emotionally neutral, and yet the work is actually extremely emotional.
The criminal justice sphere is a very emotional and complex area to talk about, whether it be victimisation, the complex emotional dynamics of domestic violence, just looking at mass media crime dramas. The very strong emotions always come to the fore, and it's difficult to see how you can analyse any aspect of police work without recognising those emotions. Now, the criminal justice system is very much, tried itself to be an emotion-free zone, or as it looks at what happened, actus rea, and then mens rea, what was the intention. Now, if you're a court taker, you've got to be able to take exact details as to what's happened to be able to establish sort of what category of crime, etc., that you're dealing with. Coverage that we've had on the media over the last few weeks and months has been very much around the lived experience seems to trump everything else. Everything is about the emotion. I'm offended. I'm angry. I'm disgusted. I feel something should be done about this, and I demand that you do it now. Is an emotion that's there. So, as the issues that call handlers are dealing with become more complex, and call handlers are being asked to assess vulnerability, assess that threat, assess the harm that's there before they can do that. There's a sense from, especially from many repeat callers, that they will overstate things because they know that they will get a response. Ultimately, if what you're describing is a threat to life, then that has to trump virtually everything else that the police service is dealing with. That becomes very problematic with people who are suffering mental health issues, as an example. If you're unable to access support and help from other agencies, you're almost, many know that if you phone the police and you describe what is a threat to your life or a threat to somebody else's life, you will get attention. And that isn't necessarily a direct result of the media, but it isn't an emotionally neutral environment in which we live. But the end product of the criminal justice system, if it ends in a court case, has to be relatively, speaking emotion-free. Although there's been a lot more of a move to recognise the role that emotions play. Certainly, victim personal statements that have been introduced in terms of sentencing have become a part. I think on one of your earlier podcasts, you were talking about the work of Braithwaite and attitudes towards shaming, and how that's very much become. I think in a previous podcast you were talking very much about sense and emotion. So they all become very, very relevant in there. But it's interesting that there is this notion that policing is about preventing and detecting crime and nothing else. But actually, there are far more things now, issues that, politically speaking, that are being put onto the police service to manage, to maintain, and the majority or significant numbers of those are emotional issues that need to be fought. So, I think emotions within society, people feeling offended, people feeling that something should be done, and in many cases, it is the police that they're going to revert to, because there are very few government agencies or social agencies that you can go to that are 24/7 and provide an emergency response. To a certain extent, if you're not clinically ill, the ambulance service aren't necessarily there for you. The fire service, if it's a fire and rescue service in its definition, they can quite simply say that no, this is not. But it's very difficult for the police service to do anything, especially when it becomes more emotional, more emotive, and you're describing greater threat, describing greater harm.
Is that something that's spoken about and acknowledged amongst the police? That because you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, aren't you? And I wonder if, is that spoken about and acknowledged that that's just part of, that is what it is for the police, or is that something that doesn't really get much airtime?
Ultimately, you've got to make that risk assessment. Generally, the more resources that you're putting towards an incident, then obviously that works its way up through a chain of supervision within the control room. So it's not just down to a call handler independently to make that judgment. But that will be being fed into those systems. And the systems themselves don't make it easy for those individual callers. There's an expectation that, especially with assessing vulnerability, if you have somebody who's contacting the police, that if there are existing police records or other government records for that matter about vulnerabilities of an individual, that just by mentioning a name, we will be able to access that. Now, computer systems are very independent of one another and required an individual to, if they were wanting to make checks around vulnerability, to access 3 or 4 different systems to do those checks. And the pressure is on the individual call handler to make those checks before necessarily making a decision. And ultimately, when that's passed on to the next line, to the officers responding, there is an expectation that those checks will have been made and that information will be made available to them whilst they're going as well. So, it's about making sure that you've got that information and then passing it on.
Yeah, thank you. And I was interested to hear what you had to say about that inverse relationship between the contact with the police and the perceived legitimacy of the police. And I'm thinking that this might have the effect of increasing post-polarisation, kind of making all the police bandy together in a kind of us versus them, which might exacerbate things. Do you think that's increased as police have become more distant from the communities they serve?
It's a really interesting question. I'm going to answer it just as my gut feeling. I can see externally looking in how it could be perceived that the police are, as you say, bandying together and have got a siege mentality and everybody's against us, sort of thing. We can't win whatever we do. But from my perspective of working within there, that actually the police service can be very internally very divided. You have police call handlers taking calls and then almost trying to negotiate with the response officers to go to these calls and saying this one's a priority over this one. I appreciate you may have a statement to take, but actually this has a higher priority at times. And likewise, the reactive staff are saying, well, I can never get anything done because the control room keep passing me another job. And there is a significant tension between control room and it's not about, I think, I wouldn't say without exception, but almost without exception, the people I worked with wanted to deliver that service that they were there. There was no desire to withhold service. There was no desire to stop that. It was a case of then trying to get the best resource within there. And as the police become more specialist and more specialist roles, you end up with lots of people being able to say, well, that doesn't fall into my remit, or that I'm too busy to deal with that. And I'm sure this isn't unique to the police service. I mean, when you get busy organisations that are split into those things, actually the internal pressures, and certainly as I was saying, as I became an inspector managing neighbourhood policing things, the the emotions that I went through going through performance groups and trying to to look at those internal battles for access to resources or time to just actually do what you consider to be your core raison were far more. So sorry, I suppose to sum up, I don't think I ever came across anything that I would describe as the police feeling we're under siege from the public, maybe under siege from other departments within the police service. And it's a case of if they could only understand what I'm trying to do. And I think that was more of an internal tension than necessarily from outside. Yes, that can spread across, I suppose, to certain other agencies who would say, no, it's 4 o'clock on a Friday, we're not back in again until Monday. And you're leaving some of their clients, some of their people in very vulnerable positions. And they naturally would then come to the police service over the weekend.
I suppose I was thinking the police strike me in some ways as being similar to prison officers and also social workers, in that there's that sense of potentially suffering from contamination, in that because they're associated with problems that no one wants in their life, so crime, or with social workers, removal of children, that certainly I think that often seems there for prison officers. They often seem to, there's dialogue about how because the people that they work with are not valued by society, that there is somehow a devaluing of their role in themselves. And I suppose it struck me that maybe the police were similar in that regard, but maybe not.
I don't know. I suppose the first thing that sort of struck me in terms of one of the issues I think that's changed perhaps within the police service as well is as society has developed, certainly over the last 30 years, the 30 years that I was a police, this sort of the lack of or move away from deference within society and social shaming as well, people not feeling that sense of social shame. The police service has increasingly been used to, or is getting more and more involved in properly policing across perhaps the whole of the community in some ways. And those for whom in the past would have said, well, the police officer should show deference to me because I'm an MP or whatever, they're also being policed as well in the same in a way that's perhaps making them feel more, dissatisfied with the police service, because the police service, in their opinion, aren't showing due deference to them, because we're enforcing the law across that side, across both sides. As a profession, I think it's fair to say that by many communities, it's not seen as it's not seen in a profession in the same way as being a doctor or a lawyer or something along those lines. And certainly that's always been a challenge in terms of improving diversity and representation within the police service, that for many countries, culturally, the police service is not seen as a high status profession, is not seen as a high status job. And so there is a certain amount of othering of the police service and police officers. It is a bit of a challenge, and I think about what was we talking about the other night. Drug use in particular. There's hardly a front bench politician that won't turn around and say, "Oh well, I sniffed, but I didn't inhale," or something along those lines, implying that they've used. And even political commentators, I think, was it Piers Morgan the other day was talking about how he had, the environment that he worked in as an editor was very much fueled by people using cocaine and drugs along those lines. And there's this sort of thing that people are admitting to the offending perhaps that they've done in the past, but there's no sense of shame about that. And I'm not suggesting that there necessarily should be, but I'm just as society has moved on, there is a general or an increasing sense that is it my responsibility to comply with the law, or if nobody prevents me from doing that, then I don't. That's somebody else's job. Does that make sense? I think there is a certain amount of divergence, I suppose, from that from them.
It's hard not to see that as being influenced by class, isn't it?
But and generally, I think the rules of accountability have changed, and it's not absolutely clear in what way they've changed.
No, I don't disagree with that. It is an interesting subject to start looking at, and I think again through my time, because I'm that. My service went back to time you're talking about police officers doing jobs that are now become civilianised. I used to have to do court jailer in the local magistrates court on a regular basis, which is now a role that's put over to detention officers. But actually, in terms of learning how the proceedings of the magistrate courts work, it was quite informative. But I remember a particular period in there where there was a great move towards making fines in particular reflective of an individual's income. And so you would have two people come up, and it was interesting watching then reading the court reporting afterwards, because in those days they still had court reporters for local papers, how you would have somebody fined £700 for a speeding offence, which was based on that individual's income, which they'd declared for the court, compared to somebody who had stolen a car for joyriding, being fined £50, or and that the whole reporting was the mismatch and the inequality in that. However, when you looked at those individuals, I think the rationale is perfectly sound, but it doesn't appeal to the emotions that are being expressed at that time.
So, moving on, Paul, what do you think could be done differently to increase satisfaction with the police?
I was looking particularly at the call handling and looking at how I could improve that. I was particularly struck by the work that I'd read with that Charlotte Knight had produced around emotional literacy. Certainly, looking at how the individual components that were in that, looking at motivation. I mean, the motivation, I believe, is there within the police service. If you look at the code of conduct as the professionalisation as a movement that's been released by the College of Policing, the motivation certainly is there. Awareness of being self-aware, the looking at emotions of others, empathy, treating everybody in a non-judgmental way with positive regard. All of those facets that come within Charlotte's definition of emotional literacy, I certainly felt were very appropriate within the policing service. When you look at procedural justice principles, and you're looking at legitimacy, if we don't start turning around some of that, or using those early calls into the police, and at least understanding that we can cause a lot of harm, even if we can't necessarily make it better, improve that, we can cause a lot of harm by getting it wrong in that first contact. So from my point of view, it was about trying to introduce those principles. And when I looked at the staff and reflected on the staff who I considered to be exceptionally good call handlers, I could go through Charlotte's definition and think, well, actually, that individual's doing it naturally. They don't need necessarily training. They need to almost try and work with them to understand how much of that they can help others develop. And I think as a key skill within individuals, as their personal development, as a tool to do your job better. There's part of the research I did. I was looking at emotional labour. If you're behaving in a way that the organisation is dictating to you, but it's not in turn with your own values, That's hard work, and you're going to burn out quicker and working within that environment anyway. So I feel there is some distance here, as I say, there would be some mileage. However, actually how you go about implementing it is a whole new story, a whole different story, I think.
You've given a pretty good description of the kind of emotional bombardment which call handlers have to endure. And I'm wondering whether it's socially acceptable to discuss the kind of emotions involved in that work, and whether there's a space to talk about them at all.
Again, I don't know if things have changed much. I suspect probably not. I think welfare for call handlers in particular is overlooked, and I think within policing generally there is very little space. Police officers are generally working on their own or in pairs. They go off, they might go through a central briefing, but they go off and they're out of the police station, they're working independently. Call handlers, although they're in a room with up to 60 other people, they're sitting with a headset on, they're looking at a screen, and they're taking calls one after the other. There is very limited opportunity for conversation and talk between them. I mean, I always find it interesting that one of the things that the economies that was made with the police service was around shutting subsidised canteens, to the extent where most of the canteens, I think there was only about one left in the whole of the force when I finished. Whereas when I joined, I mean, it was certainly seen as being a place where people would talk, where people would socialise, and you had that space to talk about things that you wanted to, whether it be over breakfast, over lunch, or whatever it may be. I think certainly there was a feeling, certainly within politicians, that there was this canteen culture within the police that was very corrosive and something that needed to be stamped out. So maybe that's part of the motivation for removing the canteens. It's interesting that the subsidised canteens in the House of Commons have to remain,
but isn't that perfect? It's such a concrete idea. We'll get rid of the canteen culture by getting rid of the canteens.
But again, maybe some of that the knock on, and again, it was the same with, and I'm not advocating, there was police social clubs and things. Virtually every police station, a large police station in every town, would have had its own social club, and those I think have all gone as well. I think I can only think of one left in the force in Thames Valley that I was working in. So those sites of that social side of things, where you got together as groups and talk, because we talked about earlier, it's not easy to talk about your work outside of the policing environment either. So if I'm being honest, I don't think there are many spaces where people get to talk until such time as they are possibly reaching a point of crisis, which I think is quite sad.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I know the answer to the next question. Do any sections of police receive clinical supervision or reflective practice?
I thought you may ask something along those lines. If I'm being honest, the only ones I was aware of would be officers in very specialist roles looking at child sexual offences against children. Certainly had access, generally access through occupational health teams. And again, I think there are a few that I would argue are being proactively dealt with. But when I looked at it, I did see that there was Dr. Richard Grove from Camden and Islington NHS Trust. He's been doing a piece of work with the Central North Basic Command Unit in the Metropolitan Police, and they have got a project running at the moment evaluating how clinical supervision and reflective practice can be introduced within the police service for more generalised, rather than just looking at those specifics. So I can honestly say I'm afraid I never came across it in the time I was there. I am aware that certain groups had, and certainly things like firearms teams, they would have been heavily signposted towards where they can get that. But again, I suspect the take-up wasn't particularly strong under those circumstances, because it's a bit more of it's an environment, again, where emotion is more likely to be hidden or suppressed rather than expressed.
Also, kind of it's associated with pathologizing something as well, isn't it? That that the implication, if it's via occupational health or you're having to be referred, that the implication is that you're not coping, rather than actually. It strikes me that much of the police work must be emotionally very, very taxing, like prison officers.
It is, and I think for many people, the double whammy is that yes, it may be that you need some help to maintain your mental health in those and helping with those emotions. But for many, it's a job that they're passionate about, and they love doing. Not necessarily enjoy that particular aspect of it, and they're maybe not coping with emotions, but they do love that. And the threat is that if they come forward, the default position will be remove them from that environment. So you're removing them from the source of stress, which is logical. It is logical to do, but nonetheless is something that for many they may not want to do that, because it could result in a step backwards away from that specialism that you've got to doing the core reactive, unrelenting job to job to job to job work that again for many isn't appealing either.
So I was also really interested to read your reference to the work of Rayner and how catching criminals remains the top priority of police, but the police are increasingly becoming another institution of the government. Can you say a bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, it seems to be a bit of a dog whistle for some politicians that know the police priority is about catching criminals and stopping and making it sound as simple as that. Well, actually, no, it's not. I mean, it is about managing crime, but assessing risk, assessing vulnerability, and I think for me, I mean, the two best examples that illustrate it from my time in the police service and the periods that I worked through are definitely domestic violence and the response to domestic violence, where the organisation that I joined and the police service culture was very reactive. Stuff happened and the police responded to it. And that was very much the way things worked. When you have things like the Human Rights Act come in, and certainly Article 2, which puts that positive duty on people employed by the state to not only to not take life, but to actively take steps to prevent the loss of life. When you start looking at murder, as a clean sheet, perhaps back in the 1980s, before, as this was coming in, you find that a significant proportion, if not the majority of murders, are domestic related, people who know one another, people who are in a relationship with one another. If you then start saying that we've got a positive duty to prevent that, then you've got to start prevent loss of life. You've got to start looking at what are those indicators within those incidents that are being reported to you, and how can you filter it out? Now, overwhelmingly, the majority of domestic violence incidents don't end in loss of life, thank goodness, but significant numbers of them do, and there's always that potential there to get there. So you're responding to a lot of incidents which previously you would have, certainly the reactive organisation I joined, I was taken to domestic reports of domestic violence by my tutor. We would talk to both parties, give suitable advice, call up the control room and say, suitable advice has been given to both parties. They'll speak to solicitors or whatever that might be, without really making any accurate, or even an attempt to make an accurate assessment of vulnerability and risk. And that takes time, and that takes, that becomes a far more complex issue to start addressing. child sexual exploitation is another one where I look back on it, and I can certainly remember getting reports of children who were out of control, consistently running away, and as many of them have reflected on themselves, they didn't consider themselves to be victims at the time. And I think, to be fair, the police service didn't consider themselves to be, they were almost willing participants. And it's taken that change in attitude, and quite rightly so, to reflect on that and then say, okay, how do we now identify those children who are at risk of becoming involved in sexual exploitation from those that are simply having a bad time and they're wanting to rebel against parents or whatever. And that involves multi-agency work. That involves a lot of accurate recording. We've got data recording implications that go with that. So it's got to be recorded accurately, timely, and it's got to be available. So every time that you then go to another job, you've got access to that previous record, or that you're made aware of that previous incident that's gone on there. So if you're looking at how you manage harm, how you manage threat and vulnerability through the police service, that is far, far more than simply waiting for offences to happen and then trying to detect what's happening, or trying to prevent those offences happening in the first place. Is that
thank you.
answering the question?
Thank you. Yes, and you've obviously been really thoughtful about your work throughout your career in the police force. So really struck by how early on in your career you were thinking about the emotions that are involved in the work that you're doing. I wondered how you envisaged your academic studies changing policing, and whether that happened in any way. What had been your hopes?
I think the ideas that I'm putting forward certainly need to look at how you could best introduce them to within the work environment. One of the things that, again, that struck me that came out of the Macpherson report, the inquiry into Stephen Lawrence, or the death of Stephen Lawrence, was an impact on training, where they came up with this wonderful mnemonic called QSAB for police training, where it looked at training being about delivering knowledge and understanding, and you can test that understanding and develop skills. So that's the KUS part of the mnemonic. But a recognition that if that knowledge, understanding, and the development of skills didn't affect attitudes and behaviour, the AB on the end of the mnemonic, then there was no point in delivering it. And this, the whole principle around emotional literacy, or what I would like to introduce around emotional literacy, is very much based on that, affecting attitudes and behaviour. There is some work that went on with Manchester Police that looked at making people more aware of policing legitimacy and procedural justice principles, and looked at how that could be introduced. And that was more around awareness, increasing awareness, rather than trying to give people a script. And I don't think for call handling you can do this with a script. You can't say to people, this is what an empathetic approach looks like. This is what a polite. It's got to be based on values that individual holds at that particular time. So I need to do some research on how best to introduce it. And as I say, I'm not saying that a new training package is necessarily the best way of introducing that. The problem overridingly for call handling at the moment is that if you're a manager in the here and now, and you've got 20 999 calls waiting, and you've got a training room next door that's got 10 people in it waiting to receive some training, what has to take priority? You don't know what those calls for, and training is constantly undermined by the fact that on any one particular day, the live data is showing you that you've got calls waiting, and can you justify delivering that training when you've got people waiting to do that? The latter part of my time within Thames Valley was overshadowed by the introduction of a new command and control system that was going to record all this data and provide much better management data. But there were tremendous problems bringing that in, and that was technical issues. But that the issues at that time were all about introduction of UIT, which required massive training time, looking at anything that would contribute to demand reduction rather than that, and without having a proven or a grounds to say this is, this is going to if you introduce this is how long it'll take to train to deliver, and this is your reductions you're going to make. You just don't get listened to. And although I believe it's in the long-term interests of, in terms of legitimacy and of the police service, and it's the right thing to do, it's incredibly difficult in this environment to actually find the space to deliver any training or to do the research to look at how you can better introduce things.
It reminds me a lot of, so working in a service with quite an active therapeutic milieu, and officers would come and work within the service, and what they would want is kind of like black and white rules to help them make decisions within the service. And they'd get really frustrated to start off with about the amount of grey ground, which was really about making sense of what was going on for individuals and then using their own interpersonal skills and their emotional response to what had happened to begin to figure out decisions. And that is something that people can do, but it's quite a costly investment, isn't it? Because actually people need to gradually adjust to working within a very different kind of environment to make those kind of decisions.
And it's difficult for organisations, especially hierarchical organisations, that want to dictate how decisions are made, to move towards what I'd call a system of value-based decision making. And you make your decisions. I think it was Buddhist philosophy that I'd been reading about at the time, that talked about decision making, and I think it was so applicable to what to call handling, in that the idea being that life is so complicated, there are so many different outcomes, that if you were to try and codify it, trying to say this is the solution to everything, it would be an almost impossible solution. So you have to make decisions based on your values. You would get a better return on investment by looking at training and instilling those core values in an individual, then allowing them to make those decisions based on those values, rather than trying to compute absolutely every possible outcome and try and get this perfect answer in line with a guidance book. And I very much subscribe to that, but it's difficult for that is also say, no, I've told everybody to look on page 3 and tick the box at the top of column 4, rather than to say, well, actually, what is it that your values are telling you that's the right thing to do? And certainly, I've been able to take a lot of what I've done. I manage a very small team now, but I've converted them all to saying that, right, this is what I want you to do about your decision making. I want you to do the right thing by the person that stood in front of you, and in line with the values of the college that we work within. And I will back you. I may not agree with some of the decisions that you've made, but if you've made the right decision based on on that value, and we'll talk about it afterwards. But it's about empowering people to make that. But you've got to invest also in looking at you've got those values based there to start with.
And also, an opportunity like that does allow for growing and learning, doesn't it, in a way that you don't get from following an algorithm, in terms of what the outcome's going to be. So, Paul, you've had a really long career in the police force. We started this podcast because we're really interested in knowing what enabled people to remain emotionally engaged and resilient despite doing such emotionally challenging work. What kept you able to do this for over 30 years? I
joined the police force. For me, the police service was very much a vocation, something that I was doing, and I suppose I never felt that anybody was profiting financially from how hard or how dedicated I put my work in. It was done for the benefit of others, if you like, and a sense of responsibility. And if I don't do it and step up to the plate, well, who else is going to do it? And I think that sense of commitment, I think, is was something that kept me going. As mentioned at the beginning, I found myself as a single parent quite early in my life. I was about in my early 20s and working full time and knowing that I'd got to keep a full time job. And at the time, I think I just got on with it and found a way to muddle through. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of my coping strategies are about muddling through and then reflecting on it later and saying, well, how the hell did I ever get through that period? Because I think if I'd stopped and thought about it, I would have never have gone down that route in the first place. I think, in common with many people within the police service, there is still a culture very much of repressing and suppressing emotions. I don't necessarily feel that I should be in any way held up that any strategy that I've used should be a model for anybody else. So I'm not advocating that at all. I'm trying to give you an honest answer as to how I've got through, and I think it's a combination of suppression and muddling through, really. And that sense of duty. I think I know that sounds a bit corny in sort of it's been overused in many ways, but it's I think it was a sense of I wanted to contribute to the community, and if I'm being honest, I'd previously worked in commercial enterprises before, and just felt I didn't want to work and to make somebody else rich. Does that make sense? So for somebody else to necessarily profit from it, it was a case of I wanted to work hard. I enjoyed the responsibility, and maybe at the expense of my work-life balance. I fully recognised, reflecting on it, I didn't get the work-life balance right. It was very much skewed in favour of work. And I suppose it's when you finish doing that work and then you've got the opportunity to reflect and start saying, well, you take that employment away from me, and then actually who am I? And I think that's the place where I am now, if that makes sense. So no, I don't hold myself up to be a model for coping with emotions.
No, but you can hear that sense of a strong vocation and a passionate commitment to want to contribute something to society and make society a better place, which I think is what you hope for within all people that are working within the public sector, that they are motivated to contribute something that's improving. So yeah, really great to have this conversation with you today, Paul, and to hear about your reflections.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Paul. I think your last framing there was very interesting and could be a topic for a whole new podcast, but it's been great meeting you. Thanks a lot.
So in some ways, I wasn't entirely surprised, but in another way I am, in terms of the opportunities or lack of opportunities that members of the police have for clinical supervision or reflecting on their work. So I think so much of what they're doing must involve being exposed to quite extreme emotion, whether it be kind of like anger, fear, disgust, shame, humiliation, and sadness. So all these kind of like really strong, powerful emotions, and then not having the opportunity to process them in a way that's just seen as that being part of the work. It seems as though you have to be singled out as looking as though you're approaching a crisis to get some of that, unless you're working in specific areas that are really associated with those extreme emotions.
Yeah, I have to say that speaking with Paul took me right back to the years I spent working in the Thames Valley Police Counselling team, which is a period which transformed my opinion of police people, really, because I met so many thoroughly committed, hard-working, intelligent, decent people through that piece of work, but also gained a massive respect for the challenges of the work that they did across a huge range of different kinds of activities. And of course, working in a call centre, taking the calls in, was in a way one of the most challenging. And I can remember talking to several people who'd described really difficult times they'd had holding calls on the line whilst they were picked up by the active officers. So I thought the piece of research that Paul had done was extremely valuable, and I agreed with some thoughts which probably passed through your mind too, that he ought to find some way of continuing to build upon the influence of that piece of work.
Definitely, and I really liked what you had to say about, rather than coming up with some algorithmic decision-making script, that actually thinking about values-based decisions being far more valuable, which also made me really delighted to think we've got David Boyle lined up for a conversation to talk about his book Tick Box, which really deals with those algorithms and KPIs, and when data is collected in a way that is not necessarily that helpful in terms of the end outcome that you're looking for. So yeah, really pleased we've got him scheduled.
Many thanks again to all of you who have listened to our Locked Up Living podcast. Feel free to mention this to your friends and to your colleagues, and give us feedback on our webpage lockeduplives.com and our Twitter account Locked Up Living. Many thanks too to Pete and Rach, who kindly allowed us to use their music. You Have Called Me Courage, and this is available from all the usual outlets.